March 23rd, 1945. 0230 hours. Mobile command post, west bank of the Rhine River, 3 miles south of Wesel, Germany. Colonel James Whitmore Harper, intelligence officer for the British XX Corps, sat hunched over a field desk illuminated by a single kerosene lamp, reading the preliminary casualty reports from the 153rd Highland Brigade's initial crossing. His hands trembled slightly as he recalculated the figures for the third time, certain he had misread the signal intercept. 119 casualties in the first wave. Not 1,000. Not even 500. 119. He glanced at the operational forecast he had written just 36 hours earlier, still pinned to the canvas wall behind him. Expected casualties for first 24 hours, 6,000 to 8,000. Probable total casualties for Rhine crossing operations, 15,000 to 22,000. The numbers had been based on every historical precedent, every intelligence assessment, every reasonable assumption about what happens when you force a river against an elite enemy defending their homeland. He looked back at the report in his hands. "This can't be real," he whispered to himself. "They must have miscounted." What Colonel Harper didn't know, as he sat in that dim tent trying to reconcile his predictions with reality, was that he was witnessing not just a river crossing, but the visible collapse of an entire nation's capacity to resist. The mathematics of warfare had shifted so completely in the previous 8 months that the German military machine, which had conquered most of Europe just 5 years earlier, had become something else entirely. Something that would take Harper and thousands of others days to fully comprehend. The Rhine was not a barrier anymore. It was a revelation. The mathematics were staggering. On the Allied side of the river, XX Corps alone had assembled 8,000 Royal Engineers with 22,000 tons of assault bridging equipment, 25,000 wooden pontoons, 2,000 assault boats, 650 storm boats, 120 river tugs, 80 miles of balloon cable, and 260 miles of steel wire rope. Over 1,600 transports, 1,348 gliders, and 889 escort fighters would deliver 22,000 airborne infantry in the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. Another 2,153 fighters would support ground operations. The British and Canadian forces preparing to cross consisted of 80,000 troops for the first 24 hours alone. Against this assembled might, German forces in the sector consisted of the 8th Parachute Division, depleted to roughly 3,800 effectives, with elements of the 6th and 7th Parachute Divisions providing perhaps another 4,000 troops combined. Behind them, the 15th and 116th Panzer Divisions existed largely on paper, their actual tank strength numbering fewer than 40 operational vehicles between them. The German defenders had perhaps 150 artillery pieces, with severely rationed ammunition, maybe 200 rounds per gun. The Allies had amassed over 3,000 artillery pieces with effectively unlimited ammunition, with some batteries pre-positioned with 5,000 rounds per gun. The ratio was roughly 20 to 1 in artillery, 30 to 1 in armor, and 15 to 1 in infantry for the initial assault. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real disparity lay in what those numbers represented. Colonel Harper had been tracking German military capability since the Normandy landings 9 months earlier. He had started his career as an analyst with the War Office in London in 1939, spending 2 years studying German industrial capacity and military doctrine before being assigned to field intelligence work in early 1944. He had watched the German army fight with extraordinary tactical skill in Normandy, had seen them nearly split the Allied advance during their Ardennes offensive in December, had read intelligence estimates suggesting the Rhine would be the final defensive line where Germany's remaining strength would concentrate. Every historical precedent suggested that an army defending its homeland fought with desperate ferocity. The Rhine was Germany's natural frontier, unchanged since Roman times. No foreign army had forced a crossing against determined resistance since Napoleon Bonaparte in 1805, 140 years earlier. The assessment Harper had written reflected conventional military wisdom. The German 8th Parachute Division defending the crossing point near Rhine consisted largely of new recruits. True, but they were stiffened by veteran officers and NCOs from the original parachute formations. Intelligence reports indicated these were dedicated National Socialists who had spent the previous month fortifying positions, laying mines, pre-registering artillery targets on likely crossing points. The 15th and 116th Panzer Divisions in reserve, while depleted, still represented armored counterattack capability. Behind them, German factories in the Ruhr industrial region, just 30 miles east, could theoretically still produce weapons and ammunition. Civilian morale reports suggested a population preparing for a final, bitter defense of the fatherland. Every calculation pointed to heavy casualties. The river itself was 500 yards wide at the crossing point, a killing zone if German artillery had clear fields of fire. Getting 80,000 men across under fire would require continuous waves of assault boats, each wave vulnerable to pre-registered German guns. The airborne operation, dropping 22,000 paratroopers in daylight directly behind enemy lines, seemed almost suicidally bold. Even if the landing succeeded, casualties of 25 to 30% were considered acceptable losses for such an operation. Montgomery's planners had worked out that the British Second Army could sustain 20,000 casualties and still maintain offensive capability. The medical services had prepared for 30,000 wounded in the first week. Harper had seen the same pattern before. At Normandy, Allied intelligence had predicted 8,000 to 12,000 casualties on D-Day. They had taken approximately 10,000. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division had been dropped with the expectation of heavy losses. They had lost 3/4 of their strength. The mathematics of forcing a defended river against a capable enemy were brutal and predictable. You assembled overwhelming force, accepted terrible casualties, and pushed through by sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Except this time, none of it was happening. The first indication came not from Harper's sector, but from 70 miles south. On the night of March the 22nd, elements of General George Patton's 5th Infantry Division had crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim without artillery preparation, without aerial bombardment, without any of the massive preparation that Montgomery was orchestrating further north. They used simple assault boats in darkness. By dawn on March 23rd, they had established a bridgehead 6 miles deep and captured 19,000 German troops. 19,000. The number represented roughly 4 divisions of nominal strength, though these divisions existed mostly on organizational charts rather than in fighting reality. Harper had received the intelligence report at 0600 on March 23rd, 3 hours before Montgomery's operation was scheduled to begin. He had read it twice, then filed it with a note. Likely represents localized weakness in overextended German line, not representative of prepared defensive positions. He had been certain that Patton had simply gotten lucky, finding a soft spot in German defenses that were concentrating further north. What Harper didn't know was that Patton's commanding officer, General Omar Bradley, hadn't even known about the crossing until the morning of March 23rd. Patton had deliberately kept the operation quiet, not wanting to interfere with Montgomery's plans, but also wanting to ensure that American forces crossed the Rhine before the British. Patton himself later wrote in his diary, "I never saw enemy resistance collapse so completely. We expected to fight for every yard. Instead, we found abandoned positions and troops eager to surrender. In 3 days, Patton's forces would advance nearly 50 miles, capturing bridges intact as German defenses simply fell apart. But on the morning of March 23rd, as Montgomery's massive operation began, Harper still believed in the conventional calculations. The British and Canadian assault went forward at 0200 hours under crushing artillery barrage. 3,000 guns fired continuously for 3 hours, expending over 650,000 rounds. The sky lit up like a continuous electrical storm, the sound of physical force that shook the ground for miles around. At 0500, as dawn approached, the first waves of assault boats pushed off from the western bank. Harper stood in an observation post with direct sight lines to the crossing point. Binoculars raised, waiting for the expected carnage. German artillery would open up any second. Machine gun fire would rake the boats. The river would fill with dead and dying men, and the second wave would push through, and the third wave, until sheer numbers overwhelmed the defenses. Instead, the boats reached the far shore largely unopposed. Captain Michael Donovan, commanding A Company, 2nd Battalion, 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers, 153rd Brigade, later testified to British Army historians about those first moments. We had been told to expect murderous fire the moment we hit the water. Every man in my boat was prepared to die. We'd written letters home, made our peace with the chaplain. I remember thinking as we pushed off, this is it. This is where half of us end. But we got halfway across and there was nothing. Just nothing. A few scattered rifle shots, maybe one machine gun that fired a burst and went silent. We hit the far shore and started inland, and we found positions, prepared positions with good fields of fire, and they were empty. Just empty. The Germans were gone. Lieutenant James McPherson, platoon commander in the same battalion, aged 23 from Edinburgh, recorded in his diary that night. I don't understand what happened. We trained for 6 months for this crossing. We rehearsed on the River Ouse until every man could do it in his sleep. We expected another Normandy, another beach where you step off the boat into hell. Instead, we found abandoned machine gun nests, with ammunition still stacked neatly beside the guns. We found cooking fires still warm. We found letters from home lying on the ground where men had dropped them. They just left, melted away like snow in the sun. The colonel said we took the objectives by 0730. We were supposed to be fighting for them at noon. By mid-morning on March 23rd, when the massive airborne operation began, the ground forces had already advanced 3 miles inland in some sectors. The paratroopers of the American 17th Airborne Division and British 6th Airborne Division landed in daylight, expecting to fight their way through German rear areas. Instead, they found confusion and collapse. Major Thomas Wellington Grant, operations officer for the British 6th Airborne Division, age 31, veteran of the Normandy drops, later wrote in his after-action report, "The landing itself was hot, hotter than Normandy. The German anti-aircraft fire was intense and well-directed. We lost 44 transports shot down and another 138 damaged. Landing casualties were significant, perhaps 1,200 men killed or injured in the drop itself. But once we were on the ground, everything changed. We had expected to face organized resistance from German reserve formations. Instead, we found scattered groups of stragglers, men without officers, units that had simply dissolved. I personally encountered a group of 67 German soldiers standing in the middle of a road, no weapons, hands raised, waiting for someone to tell them where to surrender. Their lieutenant, a boy of perhaps 19, apologized for not having a white flag. Harper spent March 23rd in a state of mounting confusion. Reports kept coming in from crossing points all along the 20-mile front. The 154th Brigade crossed at 0400. Casualties, 82. The 152nd Brigade crossed at 0600. Casualties, 73. Canadian units crossed at various points throughout the morning. Total casualties by noon, 416. Harper had predicted 6,000 casualties by noon. The actual number was 15 times lower than his estimate. By March 24th, over 80,000 British and Canadian troops had crossed the Rhine along the northern sector. Total casualties for the entire operation, fewer than 3,000. Harper's estimate had been off by a factor of 7. He spent that day pulling together every piece of intelligence he could find, trying to understand what had happened. The captured German soldiers began to tell the story. Sergeant Robert Fitzgerald O'Brien, aged 28, from County Cork, Ireland, assigned to the British Second Army's interrogation section, interviewed over 200 German prisoners in the 72 hours following the crossing. He later provided testimony to war crimes investigators about what he learned. The first thing you have to understand is these weren't the German soldiers we fought in Normandy. Those men were professionals, hard as nails, disciplined. These men were broken. Not just defeated, broken. I'd say 1 in 3 was over 40 years old. 1 in 5 was under 18. They had perhaps 2 weeks of training, given a rifle, told to defend the river. But they had no food. They were on quarter rations, and quarter rations meant maybe 800 calories a day. One man told me he hadn't had meat in 6 weeks, bread in 4 days. They had no ammunition beyond what they carried, maybe 60 rounds per man. They had no faith in their officers, no belief in victory, no reason to fight except fear of being shot for desertion. When the artillery barrage started, the older men who'd been on the Eastern Front knew what it meant. They knew that much firepower meant unlimited ammunition, meant total industrial superiority. They left their positions and walked east, just walked away. Private First Class Heinrich Müller, age 17, captured near Rhine on March 23rd, interrogated on March 25th, provided a detailed account of the German defensive preparations. I was conscripted in February. They gave us 2 weeks of training, taught us to shoot a rifle, told us we were defending Germany from the Jewish Bolshevik enemy. They sent us to the Rhine in early March. We dug positions, good positions. We had machine guns, mortars, ammunition. But no food. The rations never came. We ate what we could find, stole from civilians. Then the officers said British and Americans were coming, said we would fight to the death. But on March 22nd, the officers disappeared, just left. The sergeants didn't know what to do. When your barrage started, I was in a bunker with 11 other men. We had 120 rounds of ammunition total, no food, no contact with command, no officers. The oldest man, he was 43, he said, "Boys, we can die here for nothing, or we can surrender and go home after the war." We surrendered. I fired 3 shots total in the entire war. But it was the physical evidence that truly revealed the scale of German collapse. Harper spent March 25th visiting captured German positions. What he found defied every assumption about modern warfare. At a German artillery position near Rhine, abandoned during the night of March 22nd to 23rd, Harper counted 6 105mm howitzers in perfect working order. The guns were properly emplaced, camouflaged, pre-registered on crossing points. Beside each gun sat a small pile of ammunition, 42 rounds total for all 6 guns, 7 rounds per gun. A British artillery battery would expend that much ammunition in 2 minutes of normal firing. These guns represented perhaps 15 minutes of effective fire before falling silent. The gun crews had simply walked away. At a German supply depot 2 miles behind the front lines, British forces found 57 trucks, none with fuel. They found 3,000 rifles in crates, unopened. They found 4,200 uniforms, still wrapped. They found medical supplies, engineering equipment, even ammunition, all neatly stored and completely inaccessible, because there was no fuel to transport anything, no organization to distribute it, no chain of command to direct its use. Captain Arthur Reginald Blackwood, supply officer for the British 15th Scottish Division, age 34, from Birmingham, surveyed the captured depot on March 26th and wrote in his official report, "This depot represents the skeleton of military capability without the flesh. Everything needed for an army exists here, except the sinews that connect supply to fighting units. I found fuel requisitions dating back to January, unfilled. I found ammunition requests from February, processed but never delivered because there were no trucks with petrol. Found ration allocations that existed on paper but never reached the men at the front." The German quartermaster was still at his desk when we arrived. He'd stayed behind, maintaining his records, as if paperwork mattered when the entire system had ceased to function. He showed me his files. On paper, the 8th Parachute Division had been allocated sufficient rations for 4,500 men. In reality, perhaps 1,500 calories per day actually reached the front lines, and even that had stopped 3 days before our crossing. They were starving. An army on the Rhine, defending Germany, was starving. Harper began to compile what became known as the Rhine Assessment, a comprehensive analysis of German military collapse. The picture that emerged was of a military force that existed in name only. Consider the 15th Panzer Division, designated as a mobile reserve for counterattacking any Allied crossing. On paper, a Panzer Division in 1945 should have fielded approximately 150 tanks and assault guns, 3,600 men, and robust artillery support. Harper's intelligence officers tracked down the actual combat strength of the 15th Panzer Division on March 23, 1945. They found 12 operational tanks, 4 of which ran out of fuel within 6 hours of the Rhine crossing and were abandoned by their crews. They found 1,800 men present for duty, of whom perhaps 600 had combat experience. They found 8 artillery pieces. 4 of them captured Soviet guns for which ammunition was scarce and incompatible with German ranging systems. The division headquarters staff numbered 147 personnel. The combat units numbered fewer than 500 effectives. The 116th Panzer Division was worse. 7 operational tanks, 4 towed anti-tank guns, 1,100 men. On March 24th, when ordered to counterattack the Allied bridgehead, the division commander reported he had no fuel for movement, no ammunition for sustained combat, and no communications equipment for coordinating with adjacent units. The counterattack never materialized. The division dissolved, its men surrendering in small groups or simply walking away from their units. The 8th Parachute Division, supposedly the elite formation defending the river, revealed the deepest level of collapse. Lieutenant Colonel William Francis Donaldson, age 39, British military intelligence, interrogated the division's commander, a colonel named Hoffman, on March 27th. Donaldson's report stated, "Colonel Hoffman was remarkably forthcoming, perhaps relieved to finally tell someone the truth. His division, designated as 8 battalions with 4,800 men, actually fielded 5 understrength battalions with 3,200 men present. Of those, perhaps 1,800 had more than 3 weeks of training. He had 47. He had, officers for a division that required 190. He had 8 radio sets for battalion-level communication, all with dying batteries and no replacements. He had sufficient small arms ammunition for perhaps 2 hours of sustained combat. He had no anti-tank weapons beyond Panzerfausts, and only 200 of those. He had received no rations since March 18th. His men were eating raw potatoes and whatever they could steal from civilians. When I asked him why he didn't report his true situation to higher headquarters, he laughed bitterly and said, "I did report it. Every day for 3 weeks. They told me to make do with what I had and defend to the death. They sent me propaganda about new wonder weapons and the Führer's genius. They sent me orders to shoot deserters. They didn't send me food, ammunition, fuel, or men. What was I supposed to do?" The interrogation reports piled up, each one revealing another facet of collapse. Private Schmidt, age 42, metal worker from Stuttgart, conscripted in January. I had 6 days of training before they sent me to the Rhine. 6 days. I didn't know how to clean my rifle properly. I'd never thrown a hand grenade. I'd never been in a military vehicle. They gave me a uniform 2 sizes too large and told me to defend Germany. From what? How? With what? Corporal Weber, age 19, student from Munich. We were told the Allied soldiers were cowards who would break if we fought hard. Then we saw the bombardment. 3 hours of continuous shelling. More shells than I thought existed in the world. We were told Germany had vast reserves ready to counterattack. We saw nothing. No reinforcements, no supplies, no officers with plans. Just fear and hunger and waiting to die or surrender. Lieutenant Schroeder, age 26, former schoolteacher, officer for 4 months. I was made an officer because I could read maps and had some university education. I'd never led men in combat. I had 43 men in my platoon, supposed to be 60. 12 were over 40. 9 were under 18. We had 5 men who'd been wounded on the Eastern Front and were supposedly unfit for combat, but were sent to us anyway, because there was no one else. I had no working radio, no contact with battalion, no clear orders beyond, defend this position. When the attack came, my men looked at me expecting me to know what to do. I had no idea. We surrendered at first opportunity. Thank God we did. I heard later that the platoon to our south tried to fight. British tanks obliterated their position, all dead. Harper's analysis went beyond individual testimony to examine system-wide patterns. He obtained German fuel records for March 1945. The Wehrmacht's daily fuel consumption in France during the summer of 1940, when Germany was advancing and winning, averaged 32,000 tons per day. By March 1945, total fuel availability for German forces on the Western Front had dropped to 1,100 tons per day, less than 4% of their peak consumption. The Luftwaffe, which had flown over 1,500 sorties per day in support of ground operations during the 1940 France campaign, managed fewer than 100 sorties total during the entire Rhine crossing operation. The Allies flew 8,000 sorties in those same 3 days. The ratio was 80-1. German ammunition production revealed similar collapse. In 1942, German factories produced 25 million artillery shells. In 1944, despite Allied bombing, they still produced 19 million shells. In the first 3 months of 1945, production dropped to 800,000 shells. The railways that should have moved those shells to the front were being systematically destroyed by Allied air power. A journey that took 2 days in 1943 took 2 weeks in March 1945, if it could be completed at all. The food situation was catastrophic. German military rations in 1940 provided 3,600 calories per day for frontline troops. By March 1945, official rations had been cut to 2,100 calories per day, but actual deliveries to forward units averaged fewer than 1,200 calories. Soldiers were systematically starving. British and American rations, by contrast, provided 4,200 calories per day, and supply lines ensured consistent delivery. Allied soldiers complained about the monotony of their rations. German soldiers were grateful for potato peels. Harper's most disturbing discovery came from examining German hospital records captured near Dusseldorf. The records showed systematic collapse of military medical services. In January 1945, the German military medical system recorded 93,000 cases of frostbite, tuberculosis, and other preventable diseases. By February, the number had risen to 147,000. March records were incomplete, but projected cases exceeded 200,000. These weren't combat casualties. These were soldiers becoming non-effective through disease, malnutrition, and inadequate medical care. The German military was eating itself from within. On March 27th, Harper received intelligence from further south that completed the picture. General Alexander Patch's 7th Army had crossed the Rhine on March 26th near Worms. They had prepared for fierce resistance. They encountered almost none. The French First Army crossed near Philipsburg on April 1st. Minimal opposition. At every crossing point along the entire 400-mile length of the Rhine, the story was the same. Abandoned positions, mass surrenders, disappearing resistance. The psychological impact of these discoveries rippled through Allied command. Men who had spent 5 years preparing for the next battle began to realize there might not be many more battles. Harper spent the night of March 27th sitting in his tent, unable to sleep, wrestling with the implications. For 9 months since Normandy, he'd been planning for the next phase, the next defensive line, the next fierce battle. The Siegfried Line, they'd said, would be impregnable. It fell in weeks. The Rhine, they'd said, would be the real test. It fell in days. What everyone had been calling the European War, the great struggle against Nazi Germany, was already over in any meaningful sense. The fighting would continue. Men would still die. But the outcome was no longer in question. It hadn't been in question for months. They just hadn't realized it. He thought about all the planning, the careful estimates, the elaborate preparations. 8,000 engineers, 22,000 tons of bridging. The largest airborne operation of the war. All necessary, perhaps, but deployed against an enemy that barely existed anymore. He thought about the men who died in the airborne drops, shot down by German anti-aircraft fire, casualties of flak batteries that still had ammunition when nothing else did. Those deaths felt particularly cruel. Losing men to an enemy that was already defeated but didn't know it yet, or knew it but couldn't stop fighting. Major General Louis Brereton, commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, wrote in his diary on March 26th, "The airborne drop cost us 316 men killed and another 847 wounded. Not catastrophic losses by the standards we'd prepared for, but painful nonetheless when you realize how little German resistance there actually was on the ground. We lost more men to flak than to ground combat. The German anti-aircraft batteries still had ammunition and crews when everything else had collapsed. They shot down our planes with mechanical efficiency, as if the war was still a real contest. Then our paratroopers landed and found abandoned villages and surrendering soldiers. The disconnect between the fierce resistance in the air and the total collapse on the ground haunts me. What were we fighting? An army or a ghost? Colonel Harper requested permission to brief senior commanders on his findings. On March 29th, he presented what he called the Rhine assessment to a room full of British and American generals at 21st Army Group headquarters. The briefing lasted 3 hours. He presented the numbers, the captured documents, the interrogation transcripts, the physical evidence of supply collapse. He explained that what they had been fighting for the past 8 weeks was essentially an organizational corpse, a military force that existed on paper but had lost the material means to sustain combat operations. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, commander of XXX Corps, was in the room. He later reflected, "Harper's briefing was sobering, even disturbing. We'd been so focused on our own preparations, our own massive logistics effort, that we'd failed to grasp how completely German military capability had collapsed. The Rhine crossing looked like a great victory, and it was a technical masterpiece of military engineering and coordination. But Harper showed us we'd been fighting shadows. The real German army had ceased to exist sometime in February, starved and bled white by the Eastern Front, strangled by our air superiority, crippled by fuel shortages. What we faced at the Rhine were the remnants, old men and boys with empty rifles defending nothing with nothing. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, attended portions of Harper's briefing. He wrote to General Eisenhower on March 30th. "The German is whipped. The Rhine operation, while necessary for strategic reasons, encountered an enemy already defeated in all but name. Further operations should proceed with the understanding that German resistance will be sporadic and increasingly disorganized. The question is no longer whether we will win, but how quickly we can advance and how many casualties we will take in the meantime. I recommend maximum pressure across all fronts to hasten the inevitable end." Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, had crossed the Rhine on March 24th in a landing craft, setting foot on German soil in a deliberately symbolic gesture. He later went as far as the railway bridge at Wesel, still under occasional German fire. Churchill's presence on German soil just 2 days after the crossing had begun was meant to demonstrate Allied confidence and German defeat. He told Eisenhower afterward, "My dear General, the German is whipped. We've got him. He is all through." Churchill's assessment, delivered with characteristic boldness, proved accurate. But what Churchill didn't fully grasp, standing on the Rhine's eastern bank, was that the German army he thought he was witnessing collapse had actually collapsed weeks or months earlier. The Rhine crossing was not the great battle that broke German resistance. It was the moment when Allied forces finally discovered that German resistance had already broken, invisibly, under the accumulated weight of industrial defeat, material starvation, and hopeless strategic position. Harper's report circulated through Allied intelligence circles in early April. It changed how analysts viewed the remaining German forces. Operations against the Ruhr pocket, which should have been a protracted urban battle against fierce German defenders, instead resulted in over 325,000 prisoners taken in less than 3 weeks. The German forces simply dissolved when surrounded. Further advances into central Germany met scattered resistance. By mid-April, Allied forces were advancing at rates of 30 to 50 miles per day, limited not by German resistance, but by their own logistics and the need to accept surrenders. Captain Edmund Sheffield Reynolds, age 29, intelligence analyst with the U.S. First Army, later wrote about the disconnect between expectations and reality. "We kept preparing for the next big battle. We'd study the maps, identify the next defensive line, calculate German force strength, prepare for fierce resistance, and then we'd advance and find nothing. Empty trenches, abandoned equipment, mass surrenders. It was disorienting." the war had become a strange race between our logistics and German disintegration. We could only advance as fast as our supply trucks could move. But the Germans were falling apart faster than we could pursue. By late April, the problem wasn't breaking German resistance. It was processing the surrenders fast enough. We'd take 20,000 prisoners in a day and have nowhere to put them, no way to feed them, no administrative machinery to handle that many men. The German army had become a burden we couldn't physically manage. The broader evidence supported this assessment. Between March 22nd and April 1st, just 10 days, Allied forces took over 438,000 German prisoners on the Western Front. That number exceeded total German casualties in the entire North African campaign from 1940 to 1943. The German military wasn't just losing, it was evaporating. German fuel stockpiles in the Ruhr region, captured intact in early April, revealed the physical impossibility of continued German resistance. Allied investigators found storage facilities with capacity for 200,000 tons of fuel, containing fewer than 3,000 tons of usable stocks. Less than 2% of capacity. One facility, designed to store 50,000 tons, contained 412 tons. Germany's strategic fuel reserve on April 1st, 1945, totaled approximately 9,000 tons for all military purposes across all fronts. The Allied advance in March alone consumed over 180,000 tons of fuel. The ratio was 20-1, but it was meaningless because Germany had no reserves. They were running on fumes. German ammunition stocks told the same story. At captured depots in the Ruhr, investigators found artillery shells dated 1941, hoarded for 4 years, running out. They found factory records showing production crashes. A shell factory in Essen that produced 32,000 shells per month in 1944 produced 1,100 shells in February 1945 and shut down completely in March when coal shipments stopped. Without coal, there was no power. Without power, there was no production. Without production, there was no ammunition. Without ammunition, there was no defense. The food situation completed the picture of systematic collapse. German military food reserves in the Ruhr, meant to feed armies, had been exhausted feeding starving civilians. Warehouses designed to stock 3 months of rations contained perhaps 4 days of supplies. Local commanders had been requisitioning food directly from farmers, creating hatred among the civilian population and ensuring nothing was left for organized distribution. Soldiers foraged or starved. Officers ate better than men, creating resentment and destroying unit cohesion. The German military had ceased to function as an organized system. It had become individual men trying to survive. By mid-April 1945, Harper's Rhine assessment had become required reading for Allied intelligence officers throughout the European theater. It explained what everyone was witnessing, but struggling to understand. Why an army that had conquered most of Europe 5 years earlier was now dissolving like salt in water. The explanation wasn't tactical genius or Allied superiority and courage. It was mathematics, cold industrial mathematics that had been working invisibly for months. Germany's war economy had been running on borrowed time since early 1944. The loss of Romanian oil fields in August 1944 had cut fuel production by 40%. The systematic bombing of synthetic fuel plants reduced production another 30%. By March 1945, Germany was producing less than 10% of the fuel it needed for military operations. Every tank that moved, every truck that drove, every plane that flew consumed irreplaceable reserves. The Wehrmacht had been given a choice, move or fight, but not both. They chose to fight on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet advance threatened Germany's heartland. The Western Front got what was left, which was essentially nothing. The rail network, Germany's industrial bloodstream, had been systematically destroyed. In January 1945, German railways were operating at 43% of capacity. By March, capacity had dropped to 18%. By April, railways in Western Germany had functionally ceased to operate. Bombed bridges, destroyed locomotives, sabotaged switches, and fuel shortages combined to create total paralysis. A rail car of ammunition that should have taken 2 days to move from a factory to the front took 3 weeks, if it arrived at all. Most never arrived. The ammunition sat in rail yards, useless, while soldiers at the front ran out of bullets. The Eastern Front, where Germany faced the Soviet Union, had consumed the Wehrmacht's last remaining strength. Between January and March 1945, Germany lost over 800,000 soldiers on the Eastern Front, dead, wounded, or captured. Those losses couldn't be replaced. The young men were gone, killed in 5 years of war. The factories couldn't produce enough weapons. The farms couldn't produce enough food. The oil fields couldn't produce enough fuel. Germany had been burning its accumulated capital, physical and human, since mid-1944. By March 1945, there was nothing left to burn. What Colonel Harper and the Allied intelligence community discovered at the Rhine was the visible manifestation of invisible systemic collapse. The German military hadn't been destroyed by any single battle. It had been strangled by the mathematics of industrial war. An economy producing 10% of required fuel, running at 18% rail capacity, losing 800,000 irreplaceable soldiers in 3 months, cannot sustain military operations regardless of courage or tactical skill. The Rhine crossing wasn't the battle that broke Germany. It was the moment when Allied forces discovered Germany was already broken. The final irony emerged only in retrospect. The massive Allied preparations for the Rhine crossing, the 8,000 engineers, the 22,000 tons of bridging, the largest airborne operation of the war. All of it had been necessary and appropriate, based on historical precedent and reasonable assumptions. Military planning requires preparing for the enemy's capabilities, not their intentions or morale. The Allies couldn't have known that German capability had collapsed so completely. They had to plan for fierce resistance because the alternative was catastrophic failure if resistance materialized. But the preparations also obscured the reality. The scale of Allied superiority was so overwhelming that it masked German weakness. When you drop 22,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines and encounter minimal resistance, it looks like your massive force succeeded. Only later do you realize the enemy was barely there to resist. The Allied victory at the Rhine appeared to be the triumph of superior planning and overwhelming force. And it was. But it was also victory over an enemy that had already ceased to exist as an effective military organization. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 16th Airborne Corps, reflected on this irony years later. We planned Operation Varsity, the airborne drop at the Rhine, as if we were facing the German army of 1944. We dropped 22,000 men with massive air support, because that's what you do when you're facing a capable enemy with reserves and counterattack capability. The operation succeeded brilliantly from a technical standpoint. But in retrospect, we were like a heavyweight boxer preparing intensively for a championship fight, only to discover when we entered the ring that our opponent was starving and had forgotten how to throw punches. We won, yes, but the contest was already decided before it began. The real battle had been fought invisibly in factories and oil fields and rail yards and farmlands. not on the Rhine. We just didn't know it yet. Today, the Rhine River crossing operations of March 1945 are commemorated in museums and memorials across Europe. At the Airborne Museum in Arnhem, Netherlands, there's a display about Operation Varsity, the massive airborne assault that supported Montgomery's Rhine crossing. The display includes a parachute used in the operation, faded silk panels sewn together, and photographs of transport planes filling the sky. Visitors, mostly schoolchildren on class trips, look at the displays and ask their teachers about the great battle. The teachers explain that this was the largest airborne operation in a single day during the entire war, larger even than D-Day's airborne component. They explain how the Allies dropped 22,000 paratroopers to secure the bridgehead. They explain how careful planning and overwhelming force led to victory. What the museum displays don't show, because it doesn't fit the narrative structure of heroic victory, is Colonel Harper's Rhine assessment, filed with British Army Archives in May 1945. The document runs to 378 pages of detailed analysis, testimony, and captured records. It concludes with a stark summary. The Rhine crossing operations encountered an enemy already defeated by systematic economic and industrial collapse. German defensive capability on March 22, 1945, was less than 15% of assessed strength. Casualties were correspondingly light. The operation succeeded not because of superior tactics or courage, but because the enemy had ceased to exist as an effective military force. One elderly museum guide, a former British paratrooper who jumped in Operation Varsity when he was 19 years old, sometimes tells visitors a different story. He says, "We trained for 6 months for that jump. We were told we'd face elite German paratroopers defending their homeland. We expected 30% casualties, maybe worse. We jumped in daylight, got shot at by flak, lost some good men on the way down. Then we landed and found boys and old men who wanted to surrender. I remember thinking, we prepared for war and found a ghost. But we couldn't have known. You prepare for the worst, and if it doesn't come, you're grateful. The real story isn't about what happened at the Rhine. It's about what had already happened before we got there. The war was over. We just hadn't realized it yet. The Rhine River still flows 500 yards wide near Rhine, Germany, where XXX Corps crossed on the night of March 23, 1945. The current moves at 4 miles per hour in spring, when snowmelt from the Alps swells the channel. Small boats cross regularly now, pleasure craft and ferries connecting German towns on both banks. The fortifications are gone, the bunkers buried or demolished, the artillery positions plowed under and returned to farmland. But if you know where to look, in the regional archives in Dusseldorf, you can find the operational maps from March 1945. They show the German defensive positions in meticulous detail, every machine gun nest, every artillery piece, every prepared position. The maps are fantasies, representations of an army that existed on paper, but not in reality. The machine gun nests had no ammunition. The artillery pieces had no shells. The positions were defended by starving boys and exhausted men, with no faith in victory and no reason to die. The Rhine was never the barrier everyone believed it would be. It was a river, 500 yards of moving water, and by March 1945, the German army lacked the fuel to transport defenders, the ammunition to arm them, the food to sustain them, and the will to fight. The crossing took 3 days instead of 3 weeks, not because Allied planning was brilliant, though it was, but because there was nothing to cross against except memory and fear. What Colonel Harper discovered sitting in that dim tent at 0230 on March 23, 1945, reading casualty reports that defied every calculation, was that wars can end invisibly beneath the surface of continued fighting. The real death of the German military had occurred in February, in factory production reports and fuel consumption statistics and rail capacity assessments. The Rhine crossing was just the moment when that invisible death became visible, when the gap between organizational chart and material reality became too large to hide, when everyone finally had to acknowledge what careful observers had been seeing for weeks. The river hadn't been crossed since Napoleon Bonaparte, 140 years earlier. But Bonaparte had faced an army. The Allies in March 1945 crossed against an army's shadow, the bureaucratic ghost of a military force that had already ceased to exist. That was the real revelation at the Rhine. Not that the Allies could force a defended river, but that there was no one left to defend it. The mathematics had done their work in silence, and by the time the soldiers arrived at the banks, the war was already over. They just had to wade across to make it official.